Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. My name is Dan Monzani and I'm Aurora's Managing Director for UK and Ireland. Today I'm delighted to be speaking to Ben Wilson, who is President of National Grid Ventures. National Grid Ventures is the competitive division of National Grid PLC, and it has assets in the UK and the US, covering a range of technologies, as we'll discuss in a moment. Ben originally joined National Grid as its Chief Strategy and Regulation Officer before taking over at National Grid Ventures. Prior to this, Ben had an interesting career as CFO at UK Power Networks, a large UK electricity distribution company, and a CEO of Australia Gas Infrastructure Group. So Ben has a very wide range of experience in energy infrastructure. Ben, welcome to Energy Unplugged.
Dan, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Brilliant. Let's start talking a bit about electrification. So I wanted to ask you a broad question about National Grid's PLC's strategy, and then perhaps we'll dig a bit into how the Ventures division fits into that. Over the last couple of years, National Grid's divested its UK gas distribution network, its US onshore renewables business. We understand it's currently exploring the sale of Grain LNG. Let's talk about that latter one. I think it's underappreciated how much Grain was doing to avoid energy shortages in Europe, as well as meeting UK demand. It was bringing in US LNG and allowing it to be re-exported. So do you think that'll continue to be the case, or will continental Europe either be able to build enough of its own LNG import facilities or wean itself off gas altogether?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think gas is going to play an important role in the energy mix for a very long time, right? For decades to come. And there's a few kind of, evidence points to that. The government's Clean Power 2030 plan still envisages 30 gigawatts of CCGTs, not running very much, but very important for supply and demand when they do run. And if you look at the gas mix in the UK, I think of it roughly as a third, right? A third UK domestic, a third pipeline imports from Norway, and then a third LNG imports. And whilst over time, gas volumes will decline, capacity will decline, peak demand will decline more slowly. And actually domestic production, and even Norwegian production will probably decline more quickly than our demand does. And so if anything, the role for LNG imports, I think, is going to go up over the next 2 or 3 decades, certainly through to about 2040. So I think the outlook for grain is very, very strong, which is a very, very important element of the UK's energy mix. The grain will continue to effectively function as a sort of import terminal for Europe with gas coming in through grain and then going through pipelines to Europe. I think that's harder to foresee. I'm not so close to the demand supply balance for gas on the continent, but it's the largest LNG terminal in Europe. So I wouldn't be surprised if it continues to also support continental Europe in the way that it did, as you said, really, really importantly during the first year of the Ukraine war.
I'm sure that's right, and it's very interesting. Given National Grid has had such a broadly based energy transition strategy, including gas, and it's worked pretty well for ventures as well, why now focus so tightly on electricity networks?
Yeah, sure. So I think as a group overall, we're about 75-25 electric gas. And certainly when John Pettigrew, our group CEO, talks about that, he often says that sort of approximates roughly how he feels about the energy transition, right? That yes, we're going to see a lot of growth in electricity, but gas will still play an important role. So I think as a group overall, we're still, appropriately balanced between electricity and gas. But I think we just are super excited by the growth prospects on the electricity side. Now, some of that is driven by the energy transition, but it's also driven by the return of load growth to our sector. Now, as you mentioned in your introduction, I've been in the utility space, power and utility space for a long time, as have you. And until a year or two ago, we've been in a world where generally electricity growth has been lower than GDP growth, right? As the economy becomes more service focused and more energy efficient over time, and that's the world that we've operated in, and everything is built for that. The connections regime, regulation of utilities, everything is built for that. But we're now prospectively in a world where we're going to see electricity demand grow faster than GDP due to things like AI, to data centers, but also reshoring and general economic growth. And that supports, very significant growth in the electric sector in both the UK and the US. Mission is really foundational to. So that's a little bit the backdrop to our focus.
Really interesting. Do you see risks to that given the current political environment? I mean, to choose one example, the Trump administration's antipathy to renewables might be one, but to choose it in the UK, only a couple of weeks ago, we're recording in late July, we heard the Reform Party questioning whether they might renege on CFD contracts. So does that, at a minimum, raise a question mark over the pace at which we electrify and the networks we need for renewables?
These transmission assets that we build, whether onshore or offshore, whether competitive or in the regulated businesses, these are very long-term assets. And they take a long time to build, right? A large chunk of which is the permitting process, and then they're in operation for many decades. So I think it is really important that when we plan our systems and we plan individual projects, that we do look at a range of scenarios and we try and build things which are no regrets, because nobody knows what the future will hold, apart from some of the policy kind of questions you raised, just the general evolution of the grid. How will small modular reactors play, for example, right? If that becomes a big sector, and what does that do to the kind of spatial location of generation? So I think it's really important that we plan long term. And so I do think the strategic spatial energy plan process, the central strategic network plan process, the NESO is running. The work that the system operators do in the US is the way to back into that. I think what the kind of facts and experience show is it is perfectly possible to plan large scale transmission projects which are no regrets under all reasonable ranges of scenarios. And I certainly think the ASTI projects, for example, that we're doing in the UK, our interconnector projects, they certainly fit into that bucket. They are needed under any realistic scenario over the next sort of 10, 20 years.
Yes, I think it's fair to say in the UK there are very few raising questions about whether we need more networks or whether we should slow it. It tends to be the opposite. Perhaps a bit different to that, Ben, which you've worked on, I think, in Australia, as well as something that NGV had been involved in, is around hydrogen. Do you think that's still going to be an important part of decarbonisation, particularly in the UK? Or do you think which we're discovering new applications for electrifying transport or industry means that actually the share of decarbonisation that's met by hydrogen in the UK is perhaps a bit lower than we thought a few years ago?
I spend most of my time thinking about electrification and transmission, but we do spend time on hydrogen still, particularly in the US, I have to say. And we're working, for example, on an interesting, innovative hydrogen generation project in our US generation fleet on Long Island at the moment. I do think hydrogen still has an important role to play in some of those hard to abate sectors, high temperature, high heat intensity. I think it's got a role to play. And I do continue to believe that we should be looking at hydrogen blending into gas networks as a way to start to reduce the carbon intensity of gas networks. So I do think that hydrogen has a role to play, but I think we're all very conscious these days of the importance of system resilience and the importance of affordability. And so hydrogen really is going to have to demonstrate that it has a path to cost competitiveness. Nobody expects a new technology to be cost competitive at day one. It's quite reasonable for there to be subsidies and incentives to help new technologies get off the ground. But it will have to demonstrate that there is a credible path to cost competitiveness, I think, for people to back it in a big way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's zoom in. As you say, you spend most of your time thinking about that electrification side, and one of the major things that National Grid Ventures is known for is its electricity interconnection between the UK and continental Europe. So you own 6 subsea electrical interconnectors, including the world's 2 longest, I think, unless that's been beaten recently, Viking Link and North Sea Link to Denmark and Norway. I mean, sometimes interconnectors are criticised for the theoretical potential to export when the UK system needs power. I presume you think actually they can contribute to energy security rather than taking away from it.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. We're incredibly proud of the interconnector fleet. As you say, Viking Link is still the longest land and subsea interconnector in the world, and North Sea Link is the second longest. So we are global leaders in this space, and it makes it for a very interesting portfolio to be responsible for. I do think that interconnectors have a very, positive contribution to make. I look at what they do on a daily basis, and I can see the flows. Very often we're importing. So from France and from Norway in particular, generally we are importing, and that reflects the differences in the generation mixes between those countries and our own. Our interconnectors to the Netherlands, to Belgium, and to Denmark operate in a more nuanced way, and they will often import and export in the same day. And actually, the 1 hour time difference between the morning and evening peaks on the continent and the UK is plays an important role in that. Often, cross-channel interconnectors will export first thing and then reverse for the morning peak. So they play a very important role. I do think, as we build out more offshore wind and as we move into more of a position as a country where we will have excess electricity at times of off-peak demand, then I think prospectively we'll see the interconnectors exporting more and more, and we'll need more interconnection to support that offshore wind, and that's great for the country, right? Those exports will be happening at a time of day when prices are very, very low. And we will be able to export those wind farms. Will make money, which will benefit the UK. And the counterfactual to that is that they would be constrained off, and UK customers would have to pay for power that they're not using. So there's a very clear case. There's a very clear export case for interconnectors today, but more so going forward.
One of the things that was announced at the Leaders Summit between France and the UK a few weeks ago was exploring a further gigawatt, I think, of interconnection to France, which made me think, actually, I think you have a few gigawatts already to France. Is that sensible? Is that the right place to explore that additional interconnection you're mentioning? Or should we be thinking about those longer range connections? Perhaps, we've debated ones to Iceland or Morocco. Are those technically achievable? And do you think those are the kind of interconnectors we should be looking at rather than shorter range ones?
So there's a few things in that question. The short answer is that both will help, and I fully expect we'll see more of both going forward. Interconnection between the UK and France is really mutually beneficial because of the different types of mix, as I alluded to earlier. So with France, you have the baseload nuclear, which is must run, and so often it has an ability to export. And then what we're really seeing increasingly now is very large amounts of solar in France, which are creating solar surpluses, which we can benefit from in the UK. And we've nowhere near exhausted the kind of capacity for that. So I do think there is a strong case for further interconnection with France. And as we move more into an offshore wind surplus, then there'll be times when we export to France. There already are times when we export to France. So I think more interconnection with France. There's a good business case for that, good consumer case, but the longer distance interconnectors too. So we're working now on LionLink, which would be a further interconnection to the Netherlands, picking up Dutch offshore wind on the way. So the first hybrid DC interconnector. We're also looking at, as are others, additional interconnection to Germany, which again can be mutually beneficial. And I think the Germans see the attraction of accessing UK North Sea offshore wind, either directly if it was a hybrid interconnector or indirectly through UK exports, because it's quite uncorrelated with the rest of their generation mix. So I think Germany is quite prospective. Longer distance links, they need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. The costs do increase, and it's the consumer benefit there for some of those longer links.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And your point about actually the mixture of resources is I think sometimes lost in the debate. It's not just that we all have the same peaks, or even that we have the same supply mix, and the more we're sharing resources implicitly, that ought to help. I wanted to ask a couple. Forgive me. I'm going to have a couple slightly more technical questions around how interconnectors dispatch, because let's start with the relationship with Europe. We lost some of our efficiency when we left the European Union. We removed ourselves from some of the trading arrangements there, which meant that booking capacity on interconnectors was not as tightly linked to the trade in energy across those interconnectors as it previously had been. Have we either found workarounds to that, or do you think there are prospects for us getting back to a more efficient form of trade with the EU
Yeah, so there's a couple of frictions that have come in since we exited the single market on energy. So one is around electricity trading, and one is around carbon trading. And both of those are very, very important to get full value for UK consumers. And so we're really, really pleased to see in the summit between President von der Leyen and Keir Starmer to see an agreement to agree on both those two things. So on electricity trading, we used to be in the full kind of day ahead coupled market, and we exited that. And that means, as you say, that we optimize on a day ahead basis now based on boundary conditions between the UK and the European market, not on a proper integrated kind of view of where flows need to go. And so it is suboptimal. There are frictions there. It does reduce liquidity, I would say, on the markets. So if we can get back into full trading coupling, that could add value equivalent to hundreds of millions of pounds or euros a year for customers going forward. So that's a real prize. And that will become more important as we build more complicated assets, right? So as we do start to have hybrid interconnectors with wind at the midpoint, having a single trading arrangement will make those assets vastly simpler to operate. So that relinking the electricity trading is a really good thing, and it's to the benefit of both sides. So it's great to see that. The carbon trading, the prize here is to avoid a carbon border tax on UK exports into the EU. That would be just a straight tax, and it's a real lose-lose because, of course, when we do export, we're exporting pretty much zero carbon electricity because it'll be times when we have excess offshore wind. But because of the way that the arrangements will work in the absence of us relinking, a carbon tax would still apply. So EU consumers would be paying a carbon tax on zero carbon energy, and that will push up their prices. And it would reduce exports because the spreads would have to be that much wider to cover the tax. And the modeling that AFRI did for us showed that by 2040, the lost export volumes, if we don't relink carbon trading, would be equivalent to the demand of Denmark. So the EU would lose 8 to 10 gigawatts of imports, carbon-free imports, equivalent to the demand of Denmark. They'd have to find that somewhere else. And that volume for the UK would end up being constrained off instead of exported. And instead of European customers paying for that power and Britain benefiting, we'd be paying for power that we don't need. So there's a massive prize for both sides, and that's why clearly they've agreed to relink it. It's important that we deal with that quickly, though, because this would apply from the 1st of January next year. So either negotiations need to be finalized by then or some sort of interim arrangement needs to be put in place until they are finalized. So big prizes, tariff and non-tariff, for relinking electric and carbon trading with the continent.
Yeah, it's really interesting. In some ways, for the economists out there, this is a case study in games to trade, isn't it? I mean, both sides do win because you're sharing mutual resources and playing to your strengths. But it doesn't often sound like that in the debate. I mean, do you think it's mutually understood now that there are benefits to both sides from that closer trade?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And we spend a lot of time with the other North Sea countries and with equally the system operators, utilities in each of their countries. And there's really strong support around the North Sea Rim for this relinking. And I think the European Commission listens to that, and clearly the UK government, understands that and fully supports it. So I do think we're getting to a point now where we can have sensible fact-based discussions, and we can come to arrangements which generate economic growth and reduce prices for customers.
I want to turn to another technical issue with how interconnectors dispatch, which is to do with how we set up our own markets. And I'm certainly not going to try and reopen the debate that's been raging in the UK for 3 years now on whether to have zonal pricing or a national pricing system. But it is material to how interconnectors flow. For the benefit of listeners, interconnectors will just flow from a low price region to a high price region. So if, as in the UK, you have a single national price, but you're producing a lot of wind typically in one region and not another, the risk is if you're connecting an interconnector into a region that's actually already in surplus, but the price there is being brought up by the rest of the country, you might find interconnectors flowing in behind constraints. Now, like I said, I'm not going to relitigate the argument about it. But are there things you can see as the government now looks to reform that national pricing system that could help either interconnectors dispatch more efficiently, so that they're helping constraints rather than increasing them, or mitigation somewhere else in the system for that effect?
I mentioned earlier, I look at what the interconnectors do every single day, and they generally operate in the way exactly that you would expect, right, on a sort of intuitive basis. And I talked about that a little bit earlier. So I don't, as a lived experience, I don't really see the interconnectors kind of, flow in the opposite direction to the way that you would intuitively expect them to behave. So I don't think it's much of an issue today. We will have a lot more offshore wind in the future, but we'll also have a lot more network, and the plans are reasonably well coordinated. So we should see the onshore network get debottlenecked. And this has been clearly one of the key arguments in the horizontal debate, which is you've got to look at it based on the network of the future rather than the network of today. So I think we will see large amounts of debottlenecking, and that kind of coordinated, joined up approach between building out of generation, siting of generation and building out of networks, I think is the best way to deal with that. I do think the return to full market coupling with the UK and Europe will also help with the dispatch of interconnectors. But I think there are, as part of REMA, I think there are ongoing discussions that we can be having about how the interconnectors behave, what kind of ancillary services we can be offering as well. So I do think absolutely there's more to talk about in this space.
Okay, so it's not, we have to take it as a given how interconnectors trade across boundaries. That can be part of the discussion with Europe in order to reach the most efficient overall solution.
Sure, but I would emphasize that, as you say, they flow from low price zones to high price zones, and the market actually does a very good job of dispatching these things. And generally, where you can go for a market solution, that's often the best thing to do. And the record shows, even on times of, tight capacity, when you've got margin notices and things like that coming out, the interconnectors respond in a very positive way and at a much lower marginal cost, for example, than dispatching some of the high price gas generation that we'd have to dispatch instead. So I think we shouldn't over-index on whether there's a problem here or not. The benefit is overwhelmingly positive.
Very good. I want to turn to another thing, again, elsewhere in the National Grid group, but I think it'll be relevant for interconnectors as well, which the North Hyde substation fire. This was a fire in one of the main terminals connecting to Heathrow Airport, which led to Heathrow being offline for a day. And there's a raging debate about whose error this was. But let me ask the more general question. This could clearly happen. You could have a fire for a substation with a major 2 gigawatt interconnector coming into the country, which has the potential for very widespread impact. So what lessons do you think National Grid will be learning, or indeed the wider energy system needs to learn from that North Hyde substation fire to ensure security of supply?
Yeah, sure. And I won't get into the detail and the specifics of North Hyde. It's in a different business unit, clearly, to the business unit that I run. But I would note that we fully support the NESO report and the actions identified in that, and we're working closely with Ofgem and others on the follow-up. I think what it does, it illustrates a couple of things. Firstly, just the crucial importance of resilience in electricity networks. And we often talk about the trilemma, right? Resilience, affordability, sustainability. And events like that, events like what happened in Iberia, I think just emphasize that the most important thing is resilience. And to have, a grid system, a generation system with lots of diversity, lots of redundancy in it is the best way to get to that situation. And I think with interconnectors, building out more interconnectors means that any individual link is less significant for the overall system. A more interconnected system will be more diverse and less reliant on any individual loss, right? So I think that's a key point. I think there's another interesting point as well, which is just collectively all of us understanding what dependencies there are between individual assets, individual customers, even customers that are not necessarily directly connected to our networks, right? Maybe connected to a distribution network. So I think there's something there around just that joined up visibility. But I think building out the interconnectors, the more interconnectors we have, the less reliant we are on any individual asset.
Very good. Okay, so we talked about electrification, we've talked about interconnectors. Let's talk a bit more about innovation. And actually, I suppose we're staying with interconnectors to begin with, because you've already mentioned Line Link a couple of times. It's a fascinating project. So this is a hybrid interconnector, one that connects up offshore wind as a kind of common asset between countries. Can you tell me a bit more about why you think it's important and perhaps some of the engineering challenges you're facing in delivering that project?
Sure. So the North Sea, the combined target, the combined assessed potential for offshore wind is 300 gigawatts between the UK and the European Union. That is a massive amount of generation, and it's incredibly exciting because it really can turn the North Sea into a renewable energy powerhouse in the way that it has been an oil and gas powerhouse. But if you imagine all of that stuff connected on a radial basis, right? Each project having its own, sole use connection line, inefficient, expensive, less redundancy because you've got no meshing effect, and lots of landfall points, and so reasonably disruptive to communities. We need to move to more common use assets, and eventually in the direction of an integrated offshore grid. There's enormous benefits for doing that, and so these hybrid interconnectors are a step towards that. So rather than having a point-to-point interconnector and then separately an offshore wind project with its own direct connection, combine the two. Have an offshore platform or an energy island, have the wind come into that, and then interconnection to both countries. Gives more flexibility as to where the power will flow and less infrastructure overall to pay for and to impact communities. So it's a really exciting prospect. There's quite a lot of innovation there. So these, if you do them DC, which any decent distant ones will have to be, you're looking then at multi-terminal DC interconnectors. Now, there are some of those. We have one actually connecting in our US business. We have a multi-terminal DC interconnector connecting Massachusetts to Canada, but they are still, rare and reasonably exotic type projects. So there's some innovation there around the multi-terminal DC. A lot of innovation also in market arrangements as to how these will work, offshore bidding zones for the offshore wind, the ability for the wind to flow to both directions, and innovation in how the hybrid interconnectors are regulated with this narrow cap and floor regulatory regime. So really exciting. I think as we build out more and more of this, one thing that will be really important to get to is interoperability in DC technology. Today, it's still the case that you can't mix manufacturers in DC. You have to go the same manufacturer for the terminals in every part, right? As we try and connect up more and more on the DC side, we need to get to interoperability on the DC side. So these things, they will act as a forcing mechanism, I would say, for more innovation in the DC space.
Is that something that you need regulators to take a role in, or is that something the industry you think will evolve towards naturally because of the demands of customers like you?
I think probably the industry will take us there, but it's right to ask the question: could regulators do something to accelerate that? Could they impose requirements? We just be careful that we don't exacerbate supply chain challenges. We already have a constrained, set of supply chain capacity because of the big ramp up. So be very careful when thinking about imposing obligations around interoperability, just to make sure we don't make some of the supply chain constraints worse. We do have very tight supply chains as we go through this big expansion in this technology. So we just got to weigh up the pros and cons, but it's a reasonable question to ask. Very
good. Another area where I would imagine the UK and you in particular are thinking hard about innovation is around speeding up connections. It's a massive problem globally, but certainly a barrier to the UK's Clean Power 2030 targets. Do you think that's an area where the National Grid Ventures Group can innovate more easily than within the regulated business?
Not really. The regulated business, they deliver the construction to allow people to connect to the networks, and that's where that sits. I do think, obviously, this area is critical. The work that NESO and government are trying to do to kind of prioritize and streamline the queue is really, really important. And then I mentioned permitting earlier in this discussion. Speeding up planning permission, permitting, that is, I think, frankly, the most significant thing that we could do. And so we really support what the government's trying to do with the planning bill, and hopefully we see that come through and that will start to make a difference. It's important to note, though, that for in-flight projects, really that's not going to come in quick enough to make a difference.
Okay, very good. I suppose what I'm partly trying to get at, and perhaps let's look at this through the lens of your US business, is the extent to which competitive exposure helps drive innovation. So in the US, I think you have competition for transmission work. How have National Grid got an advantage there and managed to succeed in that competitive environment?
So the US is a series of regional markets, and today we're active in New York and in New England. And then we're also now starting to consider whether there might be interesting opportunities in MISO, which is mid-continent, so the Midwest, and then PJM, which is the Mid-Atlantic. And those are very large markets. So PJM is 3 times the size of the UK. MISO is twice the size of the UK, so very large markets. And I think the competition rules are slightly different in the different markets, but generally they're about getting new ideas, good ideas for new projects. So you can come along as a transmission developer and you can propose projects. And then the system operator will assess which projects they think have the biggest benefits for the grid and for customers. And then you can be selected on that basis. Once you're selected, you're then a regulated project. You receive a regulated return and you build it in the normal way. So the competition mechanism works really well, revealing new interventions on the grid that can add value. And I think that's the real power of competition. If we think about then the UK, that's exactly how it works in interconnectors. Ofgem opens a window. People propose, we're all free then to propose whichever projects we want to propose. And then the regulator looks at the ones that have the best consumer benefit and then goes ahead with those, right? So there's competition in the idea, in the design. And I think that's the message. So I think if we extend competition further in the UK, for example, to onshore, I really think that what I would call very early competition, so earlier than the kind of early competition that the regulator talks about, that's the real prize. Identify a constraint and allow people to propose different solutions. And you may well find that there's some fresh thinking that gets revealed there and projects be selected. I think that's what we're looking forward, rather than sort of a shootout on cost of capital or TOTEX, which then ends up with kind of winner's remorse when they realize they've mispriced the project and kind of nobody gains. You want competition in the idea.
Well, that's really interesting. And I mean, the UK government took some powers for, in inverted commas, onshore competition, although a lot of this onshore is actually subsea bootstrapped. Let's just look at the two parts of that. So one is you could have just the competition for the project, the HVDC connections that have already been identified, and most people would probably agree were needed. Would you do that? And if so, to take your point about not just wanting a sort of cost shootout, could you run that competition on speed of delivery or reliability? Or do you think it's that the ship sailed, you got to be much earlier than that?
I think maybe. I think when there are clear projects, where the intervention is very, very clear what needs to be built, I think in many cases, the incumbent transmission operators will be best placed to deliver that quickly and for a good price, right? They really ought to be able to do that, given the way those projects will be integrated with the rest of their portfolio. So I'm not super convinced that there's a massive kind of customer case, particularly when speed is the most important thing. We're talking about, removing constrained payments here. The speed, the ability to get on with the permitting and the deliver. You see that in the decision making in terms of things like ASTI awards and so on. I think where there are not yet identified projects, then that might be an area where there's scope for competition.
So this would be something perhaps for delivery in the late 30s, where the system operator starts to identify, look, we're going to be a bit constrained with all these wind farms coming to East Anglia or wherever. How do we solve that? And what kind of innovations might you have other than just building more networks there?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
But would you be talking about storage as much as networks in that scenario?
I think when you think about transmission, I think the role that storage can play kind of in combination with transmission, I think is a really interesting question. And also, if you're thinking about, offshore, then integrating that with interconnection in the way hybrid assets and so on, I think makes a lot of sense. So I do think allowing more flexible solutions, holistic solutions to be proposed would make a lot of sense.
Thank you. That's been really fascinating. I think we've had a whistle-stop tour around some of what are actually some very big themes in general around the energy transition, electrification, interconnection, and innovation, all through the lens of National Grid Ventures. So, Ben Wilson, thank you very much for joining us on Energy Unplugged.
Dan, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That was Dan Monzani, Aurora's Managing Director for UK and Ireland, speaking to Ben Wilson, who is President of National Grid Ventures. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow the podcast via whatever platform you use.